September 27th, 2025. That date, well, it marks the definitive formal collapse of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And its end wasn't just expected, it was dramatic, immediate.
Oh, absolutely immediate, like a geopolitical fire alarm going off. The second the collapse was confirmed, Iran pulled its ambassadors from the UK, France, and Germany, the E3 for consultations, they called it. But everyone knew it signaled this profound diplomatic rupture.
And that diplomatic breach, you can see it instantly reflected right there in Tehran streets. After the UN vote, the Iranian rial just plummeted. I mean, a historic low, over 1,112,000 reals to the US dollar. That kind of economic shockwave, it really tells you everything about the scale of this failure, doesn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't just some political defeat playing out in New York. It was a real societal blow back home.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to go way beyond just the headlines of this snapback crisis. We need to explain not just that the JCPOA collapsed, but really how the E3 actually pulled the trigger, why this specific timing was so critical, and, well, what this new, much more volatile era means for everyone, for global non-proliferation, for regional conflict risk.
Exactly, because this wasn't a case of someone just, declaring the deal dead. This was a very calculated legal maneuver, a procedural move designed specifically to force those old sanctions back into place.
And that mechanism they use, the snapback, it's frankly key to understanding the power dynamics here. We really need to get into the anatomy of it.
Absolutely. The snapback, it's kind of the legal heart of the JCPOA, written right into UN Security Council Resolution 2231. It was meant as the ultimate enforcement tool, sure, but the way it works, procedurally, it basically flips standard UN practice completely on its head.
Right. Usually if a country wants the UN to impose sanctions or take action, they need a yes vote, right? And any permanent member can veto it.
Precisely. But here, the whole logic is reversed. Any participant state, and this is crucial, can notify the Security Council that Iran is in significant non-performance. That kicks off a 30-day countdown, and during that month, the Council has to vote on a resolution to keep the sanctions lifted.
So, wait, they have to vote to continue the relief.
Exactly. And if that resolution fails, maybe because of a veto, maybe it just doesn't get enough votes, then boom, all the pre-2015 UN sanctions automatically snap right back into force.
So if you want sanctions to stay off, you have to actively win that vote. If you fail, they're back. Instantly, automatically. That makes the whole thing veto-proof for whoever triggers it. And it was the E3, the UK, France, and Germany who finally made that move in August 2025.
Which was just incredible, really, because historically the E3 had spent years, literally years, trying to keep the deal alive, even after the U.S. walked out back in 2018. They positioned themselves as the sort of independent guardians of the JCPOA.
So them triggering it, not the U.S., must have felt like the ultimate betrayal in Tehran, surely. Like Europe finally gave up on diplomacy.
That is exactly how Tehran saw it. The narrative was that this was the final formal capitulation to the American maximum pressure strategy. The E3 were seen as basically abandoning their own diplomatic path and choosing confrontation.
Okay, let's look at the justification the E3 gave. They didn't just wake up one day and do this. What were the specific Iranian breaches that pushed them over the edge?
Well, the justification was pretty comprehensive. It was a list of nuclear escalations by Iran that went far, far beyond the deal's limits. The big one, the primary concern, was Iran enriching uranium up to 60% purity. That stuff has no credible civilian use, and it's only a very short technical jump from there to the 90% needed for a weapon. Plus, they'd built up these huge stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, the HEU. That drastically shortened the so-called breakout time.
And beyond just the material itself, how much did the monitoring aspect play into it? The lack of transparency, was that the real deal breaker for the E3?
Oh, it was absolutely critical. Iran had already been restricting the IAEA inspectors, removing cameras, limiting access. But the breaking point, the real crisis point, seems to have come around June 2025. After those reported military strikes on some nuclear sites, Iran apparently failed to give a credible, verifiable account for over 400 kilograms of ATU. That created this massive, just intolerable blind spot for the West about Iran's immediate capabilities.
And it wasn't just about the breaches, was it? The E3 were also up against the deadline.
Yes, they were basically forced into the strategic corner, a kind of use it or lose it scenario. The entire legal basis for snapback, UNSCR 2231 itself, was set to completely expire on October 18th, 2025. That was called Termination Day.
So the deal essentially had a built-in self-destruct date for the enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
And the E3 had to use snapback before that date or lose the power to use it forever.
Precisely. If they'd waited past October 18th, The whole Iran nuclear file would have been permanently removed from the Security Council's Chapter 7 authority. And just to remind everyone, Chapter 7 is the UN's heavy enforcement toolkit, mandatory sanctions, even military action. Losing that multilateral leverage, especially given how far Iran had advanced its program, was just seen as an unacceptable risk down the line.
Now, the E3 claimed they made one last big offer right before triggering Snapback. How did Tehran react to that final diplomatic push?
Tehran. Completely dismissive. They framed that E3 offer not as a genuine negotiation, but as a trap, a diktat. Their argument was, look, how can the West demand concessions from us now when the U.S. violated the deal years ago? Their official line was that the E3's move was a fundamental abuse of the mechanism itself.
And that quote from Iranian Foreign Minister Arachi, it's really stark. The U.S. has betrayed diplomacy, but it is the E3 which have buried it. Is that just effective propaganda, or does it capture the E3's real dilemma?
I think it's probably a bit of both. For the hardline audience inside Iran, it perfectly confirms their worldview. See, the West can never be trusted. But it also, maybe unintentionally, highlights the impossible spot the E3 were in. They genuinely felt they'd run out of road diplomatically. They'd spent 7 years trying to salvage a deal that was, let's face it, hollowed out by Iran's own actions and relentless U.S. pressure. So yeah, that quote really crystallizes the depth of the breakdown.
And this whole crisis didn't just stay between Tehran and the E3 capitals, did it? It immediately spilled onto the floor of the UN Security Council, right into that great power rivalry. Tell us about that final vote.
Right, that vote on September 26, 2025, it basically became a live test of global alignment. Russia and China put forward a draft resolution specifically to delay the snapback for 6 months, clearly an attempt to buy Iran more time and, challenge the Western position.
But that effort to delay, it failed spectacularly. Only 4 votes in favor, right? Russia, China, Algeria, Pakistan.
Yeah, exactly. And 9 members voted against the delay. That resounding failure, well, it just confirmed what many suspected. The cooperative P5+1 spirit that created the deal in 2015. Completely gone. Dead. The JCPOA was now fully tangled up in this zero-sum great power competition.
So does this suggest Russia and China defending Iran isn't really about the nuclear specifics anymore? It's more about their bigger goal of pushing back against U.S. influence globally?
I think that's a major part of it, yes. The partnership has solidified. We've seen growing military and economic ties, especially, since the war in Ukraine. For Russia, backing Iran at the UN is a way to poke holes in Western foreign policy. And conversely, for the West, triggering snapback became not just about non-proliferation, but also partly a punitive measure against Iran for cozying up to Moscow and Beijing.
The language must have been pretty sharp during those debates.
Oh, deeply acrimonious. Russia slammed the Western move as clumsy blackmail, predicting it would inevitably lead to regional escalation. What the world saw was the final shattering of any multilateral consensus on this critical issue. It was replaced by these hardening geopolitical battle lines.
Okay, let's pivot to the immediate concrete consequences. Midnight GMT, September 28, 2025. What actually changed on the ground, legally speaking?
Well, 6 previous UN Security Council resolutions targeting Iran's nuclear and missile programs, they all automatically came back into force. And this isn't just symbolic talk. It's a comprehensive, legally binding international sanctions regime. Every single UN member state is now obligated to implement them. It basically rewound the clock to the peak pressure era before 2015.
Let's break that down. It sounds like Iran is now legally boxed in on multiple fronts. Finance, weapons, the nuclear program itself.
That's exactly right. Think of it in 3 main buckets. First, nuclear activities. A complete ban on all uranium enrichment, any reprocessing heavy water projects, basically the core proliferation risks. Second, ballistic missiles. A strict prohibition on any activity related to missiles that could potentially deliver nuclear weapons. And third, a comprehensive conventional arms embargo. No selling major weapon systems to Iran, tanks, combat aircraft, warships, you name it.
And crucially, the money. The financial pressure ramps up massively globally.
Yes. That restoration includes global asset freezes and travel bans hitting dozens of Iranian entities and individuals again. And maybe most importantly, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is back under specific mandatory UN sanctions.
Now, given that the IRGC is so deeply embedded in Iran's economy and controls a lot of the, let's say, unofficial trade networks, does this UN pressure actually work? Or does it just push everything further underground, making it even harder to track?
That's the million-dollar question with sanctions, isn't it? The core conundrum. Tehran is definitely adapting. We're seeing them double down on what analysts call nuclear hedging. Meaning they keep advancing the technical skills, the know-how, the enrichment capacity, building those stockpiles needed for a quick breakout if they choose. But they stop just short of the most irreversible steps.
Like pulling out of the NPT altogether.
Exactly that. They won't formally withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's the bedrock agreement here. And they probably won't expel all the IAEA inspectors. Why? Because they want to keep that tiny sliver of diplomatic leverage, that thin connection to the international system.
And economically, with the official channels closing again, where do they turn?
Well, their strategy seems heavily focused on deepening ties with non-Western powers. An advisor to President Pezeshkian actually stated they will explicitly use the capacity of India and China to supply essential goods. They're relying on huge, discounted oil sales, mostly to Beijing, to keep the money flowing and bypass that global pressure.
Which brings us to this huge paradox, maybe the biggest unintended consequence of the whole snapback thing. The goal was to punish and isolate the regime, particularly the hardliners. But the action itself might actually end up strengthening them.
This is potentially the most significant and worrying long-term impact. You have to remember, the JCPOA was the signature achievement of Iran's moderate, reformist political faction. Its total collapse completely discredits them domestically. It basically proves the hardliners right, validates their long-standing argument that diplomacy with the West is pointless, that confrontation is the only language understood.
And because the IRGC is the organization that actually runs those sanction-busting networks, the illicit trade, the oil smuggling shutting down the diplomatic route might have inadvertently handed them more economic and political power.
It absolutely risks reinforcing the very internal power structures the West finds most problematic. We've essentially traded a flawed deal, one that at least had some monitoring, for an unconstrained confrontation that simultaneously empowers the actors we most wanted to contain. It's a tough outcome.
So where does this leave us? Looking ahead, we've swapped imperfect constraints for what sounds like massively increased risk.
The number one implication, sadly, is a substantially higher risk of military conflict. The JCPOA, for all its flaws, did provide a framework, however shaky, for monitoring and, crucially, for deconfliction between major powers in the region. With that gone, the guardrails are off. Checks on Iran's program are weaker, and the potential for miscalculation, maybe preemptive strikes by Israel or even the U.S., goes way up.
And the prospect for somehow getting back to the table for a new deal. If they couldn't agree when sanctions were off, how can they possibly agree now that maximum sanctions are on?
It looks incredibly bleak right now. Any future talks would be vastly more complicated. Mutual trust is probably at an all-time low. And crucially, any new deal would almost certainly have to tackle the issues deliberately left out of the 2015 agreement: Iran's ballistic missiles, its network of regional proxies. Tehran has absolutely zero incentive to negotiate on those core security issues while under this level of pressure.
So if a comprehensive deal is off the table for the foreseeable future, the focus has to shift, right? Away from negotiation towards just managing the danger. What are the practical steps the West needs to take in this new reality?
Okay, priority number one has to be establishing discrete, reliable crisis management channels immediately, using intermediaries, maybe Oman, maybe Qatar again. The goal isn't to negotiate a grand bargain right now. It's simply to deconflict military movements, to prevent accidental clashes from spiraling out of control. That channel needs to be hot, constantly available.
Is there any room for even limited diplomacy? Anything beyond just preventing accidents?
Well, the most pragmatic goal might be exploring some kind of limited interim agreement. Think less for less. Maybe Iran agrees to freeze enrichment above 60%, maybe restore some of the enhanced monitoring they rolled back, and in return they get very targeted sanctions relief. Perhaps unfreezing specific assets purely for humanitarian trade. It's basically a stopgap designed to buy time and lower the immediate temperature, not a lasting solution.
And the longer-term strategy. If diplomacy is limited, what replaces it?
It fundamentally shifts towards containment and deterrence. That means working to strengthen regional security partnerships, boosting intelligence gathering on Iran's activities, and critically, maintaining a very clear, credible military deterrent to persuade Iran not to cross that final nuclear threshold, not to build a weapon. Look, the era of trying to achieve consensus on Iran through a big multilateral deal, that's over. We're now in the business of managing an unconstrained threat within a much more polarized world.
So we've traced the technical snapback mechanism, the diplomatic breakdown, the geopolitical fallout at the UN, and now these really sobering policy realities. The snapback crisis wasn't just the end of a deal. It really pushed the entire Iran issue right into the heart of this global struggle between competing power blocs.
It did. And that leaves us, and you listening, with a really challenging final thought to chew on. The collapse of a major non-proliferation agreement, one that was actually endorsed by the UN Security Council, sets a deeply damaging precedent globally. Think about it. When even a fully sanctioned, internationally backed deal fails this spectacularly, what message does that send to other countries maybe thinking about pursuing nuclear weapons? Does it suggest that diplomacy is ultimately unreliable? That the only real security guarantee comes from actually possessing the bomb? If that's the takeaway, it fundamentally undermines decades of global effort to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. And that implication, well, it reaches far, far beyond the Middle East.
That is a deep and frankly unsettling question to consider as we navigate this new era.
Indeed it is.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the collapse of the JCPOA and its complex aftermath.
It was an essential, if difficult, conversation to have.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive, where we analyze the stories shaping our world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.